Hello, Meachum Village. So, if you follow the news or politics, there's this idea floating around about a 50-year mortgage. A 50-year mortgage. This is basically a debt that you get to buy a house, and you will, instead of getting the normal 30-year mortgage to pay it off, you will now get 50 years to pay it off. So, if you buy this house at 20, you'll be paying on that thing till you're 70. And this is being touted as a way to help Americans afford housing, because I believe the average cost of a home right now is about $400,000. The interest rate is at like 7%. None of that is going down. And so President Trump has touted this idea that instead of 30-year mortgages, let's get 50-year mortgages. And the benefit is supposed to be that you'll have a low monthly payment. You maybe even have a lower down payment, because you'll have a longer term to pay it off. Should Christ followers consider getting a 50-year mortgage, especially if you are a young couple, recently married, you're looking to buy a home, buy or settle down home? Should you get your home with a 50-year mortgage? This is a Christian channel, so I'm not going to cuss. But if there was a million other ways to say no, absolutely not, unbelievably no, 1,000 times no, 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 no sane person should be getting a 50-year mortgage. The 30-year mortgage is a bad idea. The 30-year mortgage, which I believe FDR introduced, is a bad idea. It's a bad idea from a biblical perspective. It's a bad idea from a financial perspective. It's a bad idea from a social perspective. So let's go through a couple reasons why anybody who's reading scripture, anybody who's following scripture, should be a firm no on a 50-year mortgage. Number one, our channel tends to shine a spotlight on the particular issues of Black Americans, particularly those who are descendants of enslavement and Reconstruction and Jim Crow and the migrations. We are already the brokest people in the country. We're already the brokest people in the country. We have more student loan debt than other groups. We have more medical debt than other groups. We don't tend to pass on any inheritance to the next generation like other groups. This will just put us even further behind. There is no benefit to Black Christ followers who are married, who are looking to buy a home, to fall into yet another debt trap like this. I did a video previously on the baby boomers who haven't left the country better off financially than they received it, because they fell into every debt trap spoon fed to them. You know, jumping rate mortgages and interest only debt and all of these traps. 50-year mortgages are just another trap, and it will hurt Black Christian families, Black Christian couples, even more than we're already hurting with all this student loan debt, all of this consumer debt, and all this medical debt. Here's a data table from the Census Bureau that talks about distribution of household net worth based on the race of the householder, meaning the person who is on the lease or the mortgage. 0 or negative, 23.6% with a Black householder. If you look at this chart, what you're seeing is that among Black people who are on the lease or on the mortgage, we are the least likely to have any money. We're the least likely to have a net worth above $100,000. And it's because we're struggling in debt. So if we're struggling with student loan debt and medical debt and credit card debt and the 30-year mortgage, why on earth would a 50-year mortgage make sense? Just say no. Also, I'm going to let Dave Ramsey's team break down why the math on this just doesn't even make sense. Because we have this thing called interest, and you pay interest on top of principal for the life of the loan. So you're paying 50 years of interest for the life of the loan. Here's why, in the end, you'll end up paying way more for that house on a 50-year mortgage than you would otherwise.
Not what this does. The 50-year mortgage does not make homes cheaper. In fact, it makes the housing crisis into a dumpster fire. And let's walk through the reasons why this is. Number one, the math doesn't work here. Let's look at the numbers that have been thrown out there. We're going to take a $450,000 home as the example. A 30-year mortgage at 6.25%, about $2,700 a month. Total interest paid over those 30 years, $547,000. Not great, remember, on a $450,000 home. But now let's look at a 50-year mortgage, and to keep it apples to apples, I'll even give you the same exact interest rate at 6.25, which is not going to happen because this is a much riskier loan, so banks are going to charge more for it. But let's just say it's the same interest rate. Well, your payment now becomes $2,450 a month. So you're saving $300 at best with this loan. Total interest, this is the kicker, over $1 million in interest alone on a $450,000 house. Do you understand how insane that is?
So there you have it. There's no scenario where the numbers on this make sense. It is not a benefit to you financially. Over the life of that loan, you'll end up paying significantly more for that home than you would with a 30-year mortgage or preferably a 15-year mortgage. The other reason the 50-year mortgage is a firm no is because long-term debt is unbiblical. 30-year mortgages are unbiblical. So 50-year mortgages are definitely unbiblical. Proverbs 22:7 says, "The rich rules over the poor, and the borrower is servant to the lender." In Scripture, debt is associated with slavery. Debt is associated with poverty. There's a worldly perspective where people will try to position debt as a good thing. It's a tool that you leverage to protect your cash so that you can acquire assets. That is not how Scripture ever presents debt. In Scripture, debt is always associated with poverty. It's always associated with slavery. And in our current system, where we are awaiting the collapse of our economic system, and where Revelation 13 tells us that Christ followers will not be able to buy or sell, the last thing you want is more ties to government systems that will shut down and try to control you through long-term debt. We all need to be working on paying off our debts, not getting into longer debts. At the end of that video, he goes on to say that this will shift us from generational wealth to generational debt. Well, for Black people, we're all very familiar with having no generational wealth and only generational debt. Many of us have buried fathers and grandfathers who left nothing but bills. They left barely enough to cover the funeral. They didn't have enough life insurance. We already know what time it is. We don't want to be that way for our grandchildren. So here's the solution. Here is the solution, particularly for those of us who are trying to follow Scripture and want our children and grandchildren to follow Scripture too. I think we should operate under the assumption that the housing market is not going to be accessible for our children and grandchildren through debt. I do believe that eventually we will go to a longer term mortgage. I believe it'll be the standard debt product for acquiring a house, much like the 30-year mortgage is the standard debt product for acquiring a house. We are going to have to do what Scripture says. We are going to have to secure housing for our children through inheritance. We are going to have to secure housing for our children and grandchildren through inheritance. That means that any properties that we are buying now, we are buying to pay them off and pass them on. We're buying properties to pay them off and pass them on. I do not want my children knocking on some bank's door saying, "Hey, can you tie me up in a 50-year mortgage so I can have a place to live?" We need to be on beast mode about cutting that off, especially those of us who are following Scripture and know what it says about debt. Here's what Proverbs 13:22 says. "A good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children, but the wealth of the sinner is stored up for the righteous." We are supposed to be leaving an inheritance to our children's children. Our grandchildren should be set up with a basic need like housing because of our planning right now. Now, I know what many of you are also saying. Well, how can I pay it off? How can I pay it off? If you can't pay it off, make sure that your life insurance policy can when you pass away. Inheritance is one of the things that Moses directed the ancient Hebrews on when they came out of slavery. And we see this play out in the story of King Ahab trying to buy a vineyard from a man named Naboth. I think that's how you say his name. And Naboth won't sell it because it's his family's land. Here we go. This is 1 Kings 21. Ahab said to Naboth, "Let me have your vineyard to use for a vegetable garden, since it is closer to my palace. In exchange, I will give you a better vineyard, or if you prefer, I will pay you whatever it is worth." But Naboth replied, "The Lord forbid that I should give you the inheritance of my ancestors." Many of us come from families, Black Americans come from families where our grandparents inherited land. Now, there's plenty of stories about what happened to that land. I know that in my family, my grandfather squandered that inheritance and passed on nothing to his children. My great-grandfather left my grandmother a building, and she squandered it and passed on nothing to her children. We have to adjust our mindset around wealth. It was against the rules of God to sell your family's land or squander your inheritance. And because the housing market will only be accessible to our children and grandchildren through high interest rate, longer term debt, we have to be much more serious about inheritance. That means that right now we are buying properties to pay them off and pass them on. We are buying properties to pay them off and pass them on. So how can we do that? Number one, get on beast mode about paying off our mortgages. My husband and I have paid off one mortgage. We want to pay off another one. And that will be the two assets we can leave to our children. This is the way I'm thinking because, like I said, I don't want my kids having to ask the bank to loan them money for 50 years at a higher interest rate just for them to have a place to live. Here's another thing that we need to do. We need to stop moving. Stop relocating. My husband and I are coming up on our 15-year wedding anniversary. We had a conversation about how many times we had moved as adults, right? Just since we moved out of our parents' house, college and all of that. It was somewhere in the double digits. And even since my son has been born, my son is now 11. Even since our son has been born, we have moved 5 times. We've had 5 different residences. That is a recipe for disaster. Constantly moving and constantly relocating. Every time you move, it's thousands of dollars to relocate. It's even more than that if you're closing on a home, putting a down payment on a home, if you're moving into a home where you're not getting much equity. All of this relocating is costing us. And if you're buying a home every time, that 30-year mortgage clock starts over every time you close. Stop moving. Let's get settled into communities that make sense for our children and grandchildren. Let's pay off those houses so we can leave them to our children and grandchildren. The third thing we need to do is, if you're not in a position to buy a building or a home that you can pay off and leave to your children and your grandchildren, another option is to buy land. Buy land. Leave your children and grandchildren an acre of land. If you have 4 kids, buy 4 acres of land and leave it to them in a trust. And preferably buy land in a place where one day they could build a house on it, or one day they could grow food on it, or they could have animals on it, whatever they might want to do. But at least they have some asset that if they have to sell it or if they have to build on it, they at least have something. They have something that you have left them. And then the last thing we need to be passing on is not just property, but skills. We need to be passing on biblical skills around managing money, biblical skills around not squandering what is left to us. Because it's one thing to leave your children or your grandchildren assets, but it's quite another to train them on how to steward those assets when you're gone. In addition to skills on how to manage, it also needs to be skills on how you maintain. We need to get back to teaching our kids how you build things. How do you fix things? How do you maintain a home so you're not always calling on a contractor to do it, which is eating into your money? And you may not have that money if you end up with a 50-year mortgage with a 10% interest rate. So we're a firm no on this 50-year mortgage deal. As much as you can, pay down your debt, even your settle down home, so that we can start leaving assets to our children instead of leaving them with debt. Let me know what you think in the comments. I'll catch you on the next one.